So today's video is going to be another solved true crime case. Today we're going to be talking about a case from Tamworth in Staffordshire, England. Staffordshire is a seemingly safe, friendly, quite a large town, or at least it was safe and friendly in the year 2000, which is when this case takes place. There'd actually been no murders in Tamworth for almost 3 decades, but of course nowhere is ever 100% safe. But before we jump into this case, just a couple of things. Maybe there's a link on screen right now. Maybe there's a link in the description. I don't know. I'll talk about that a bit more at the end of the video. And this video is kindly brought to you by NordVPN, an amazing virtual private networking service that helps you protect your information online. The VPN acts as a barrier between you and people trying to access your private information by making it seem as though you're operating from another IP address somewhere else in the world. And because you're using a different location's IP address, you get to access the internet as though you're from that location. So if you chose an American IP address, you can access American Netflix or YouTube videos that are blocked in your country. To me, a VPN is essential because I do a lot of my work when I'm like on the train or in a cafe or something like that, always on the go, and you never know how secure those public Wi-Fi networks are. Sometimes public Wi-Fi networks can be a bit dodgy, so I like to make sure that I'm protected from like hackers and stuff using NordVPN. Last chance to take advantage of the usual discount code that NordVPN offer, 70% off of your subscription, making it just $3.49 a month, plus an additional month free. To snatch that up, just go through my link, which is nordvpn.com/Eleanor, and use the code Eleanor at checkout. Thanks again to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. Now let's get into the case. But before we do, I would just like to give my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this video. This video is for educational purposes, and everything that I'm about to say is just information that I have found on the internet and I'm compiling into one video. Quick warning before we do get into this video, this case does involve attempted sex crimes. Nothing actually happens. Don't know if that's a spoiler. But, you know, if you can't watch that kind of thing, then click out now. I'll be back again soon. So like I said, today's video takes place in Tamworth, a pretty big town in Staffordshire, just north of Birmingham in the West Midlands of England. Tamworth is a very friendly, comfortable town. It's one of those kind of towns where you don't really leave. If you were born and raised in Tamworth, then you're likely going to stay in Tamworth and move out and raise your own family in Tamworth. And like I said, there'd been no murders in that town since the early 70s, and this was the year 2000, so families were perfectly happy letting their kids just go out and play at parks or walk home alone from school, stuff like that. Like, people weren't overly cautious because it didn't have very high crime rates. Heather Tell was a 17-year-old schoolgirl from the area, known for her beautiful smile and long flowing blonde hair. But beyond her looks, Heather was one of those just really happy, smiley, positive people. She was kind of known for this really positive, kind energy that she had. She was just one of those really bright people. And she was known for just making others happy just by her presence. She was a very nice, normal girl with a nice, normal group of friends. She was well behaved. She was just very like girl next door kind of character. She had a huge passion for dancing and she was really good at it as well. She spent a lot of nights a week practicing dance at her local dance studio. She was actually studying dance in college at the time of this case. She went to Sutton Coldfield College and eventually she wanted to make it her career somehow. And one thing she was known for in her dance group was her ability to put emotion into her dance. So whether it was like a serious piece or like just her smiling and bringing a lot of energy to her routines. And at the time of this case, she wasn't far off her 18th birthday, and 18 is always a big one in England, so her and her friends have been planning it for ages. They wanted to go to London and have like a big shopping spree. On August 25th, 2000, 17-year-old Heather Tell was planning to meet up with a friend at the local dance studio and then go to the cinema to watch a film together. This was the same dance studio that she used to go to multiple times a week for dance practice, and she walked there every single time, and she was a very responsible, sensible girl, and so her parents trusted her to do that walk alone. She'd done it plenty of times before and she was fine. She planned to meet her friend Laura at Belgrave Dance Studio, which wasn't very far from Tamworth Town Centre, at around 8:30 p.m. that night. However, Heather failed to turn up. Laura was waiting outside the dance studio for ages and Heather was nowhere to be seen. And so she started calling her, but there was no answer on her phone. So she was thinking, well, maybe she ditched her, or maybe she was ill and she decided to stay at home or something. And so Laura called Heather's home phone. Heather's father picked up and Laura explained to him that Heather hadn't turned up. And he said, oh, well, that's strange because she set off a while ago, so she should be there by now. The Tell family were rightly concerned, and so they started calling Heather's phone, but there was no answer. And so they decided to go out and look for her. Go out and walk the path that she would have taken to get to the dance studio to see if they could find her. So her immediate family set off from the house and they took the exact same route to Belgrave Dance Studio that Heather would have taken. But they didn't see Heather anywhere along the route. And as time's going on, it's getting darker outside. More and more family members are joining the search because the family's getting more and more worried, but still no sign of Heather. And then by 10 p.m, the family had been looking for about an hour at this point, and it was getting dark outside. It was pretty much dark. And the family knew that they couldn't do this by themselves. And so they called the police and reported Heather as missing. So police came out to interview the Tell family and just get a description of Heather, maybe some pictures, some kind of idea of what she was doing that night, what her life was like on the normal day-to-day routine that she had. Meanwhile, other officers had formed a search party with Heather's more kind of extended family, her friends, some volunteers from the town, and they were just going out walking, manually searching for Heather. And because of the severity of this case, a minor missing in the middle of the night when it's dark, they were pulling out all the stops. There were even sniffer dogs brought to the initial search, and that's not done often. Dogs are normally brought in a little bit later when they can't find people in the initial search, but due to how serious this was, they brought the dogs in right away. The main focus of the search was the route that Heather would have taken that night to get to the dance studio. So from her house, there were a few streets that she would walk down, and then the last bit of her walk was through a park. She took a shortcut through this kind of very overgrown, grassy, tree area. This park that she walked through was called Kettlebrook Linear Park, but I think a lot of locals called it Belgrave Park because it was near Belgrave Dance Studios. So a lot of the search was taking place in that park and on that path, but of course other officers and other volunteers were searching pretty much the whole of Tamworth at this point, because it had been over an hour since she was last seen, over 2 hours since she was last seen at this point. So she might not still be on that route. A lot of the search took place in that park because there was a lot to search. Like I said, it was very overgrown. There were a lot of bushes, a lot of trees, and, you know, there were a lot of kind of hidden places that needed looking through. So that was where a lot of the searches were. This continued through the night and into the early hours of the morning. Of course, volunteers and people like that were leaving to go to bed, so the numbers of the search party got less and less through the night. But the next morning when everyone woke up, there was still no sign of Heather Tell. She hadn't got in contact with anyone, no one had seen her, so now it was very concerning. On the morning of the 26th, a family friend of the Tell family was cycling through that same park that Heather would have walked through when he saw something in the bushes. So he got off his bike and walked into the bushes to get a closer look, and that was when he saw a naked human body lying there in the undergrowth. And as he got even closer, he saw the long blonde hair and he saw the face, and that was when he realised that this was the dead body of Heather Tell. He called for police to come straight to the body, and the area was cordoned off immediately, as this case had now turned from a missing persons case to a homicide investigation. It was raining pretty badly on the morning that Heather Tell's body was found, and it had been through the night, and so there were immediate fears that maybe this rain had washed away critical pieces of evidence like DNA, saliva, blood, fibres, anything like that on the body. But there's nothing they can really do about that. They put up a tent immediately to prevent any further damage from the rain, but what was done was already done, and so they just had to do tests on the body as well as they possibly could. And bear in mind, this was 2000, and so tests were nowhere near as good as they were now, 20 years later. They were still quite basic back then. But luckily, Heather's body was found, like I said, in lots of undergrowth, under a few trees. The damage to any, evidence or anything like that had been minimised because the body had been protected by all these trees. So detectives got to work looking at the crime scene, and right from the off, they can already tell that this murder was probably sexually motivated. If it wasn't sexually motivated, then there would be little need for her killer to take off her clothes, and Heather was found naked. I couldn't actually find if her clothes were found at the crime scene. I know her underwear was found close to her body, and some sources say that her knickers were even stuffed in her mouth. However, I did only read that on a couple of sources, so I can't really say that as fact. But she was naked. She had her clothes taken from her body. So this seemed to be sexually motivated. Why else would someone do that to her? Police could also tell just from looking at the body that Heather's cause of death had most likely been strangulation. You know, this wasn't done with someone's bare hands. This was done with an item, and it seemed to be very thin because the line on her neck was very thin. So it was like shoelace or rope or something. As the crime scene investigators were working inside the tent by the body on the crime scene, other officers were searching the rest of the park, so all the other different bushes and things to see if anything had been discarded, maybe a weapon. A team of divers was brought in because there was a river that ran from one end of the park all the way to the other, and this was a linear park, so if you don't know what one of those is, it's one that's more long than it is wide. So it ran all the way from the top all the way to the bottom. It was a big job, and it ran right by where Heather's body was found. So it was very possible that her killer might have discarded of a weapon in there, or, you know, anything, any kind of evidence that could identify them. Heather's earrings were found relatively close to her body, so it seems as though they'd either been ripped out or maybe came out in a struggle. Her mobile phone was actually found in the grass on the opposite side of the path, so it seemed as though that had maybe been thrown there. Some sources say that the phone was broken, some say it was broken in two. So I don't actually know how broken the phone was, if it was smashed at all. And on a search of Heather's mobile phone records, it actually shows that she was trying to call her house phone around the time that police believe that she died. So it's very possible that maybe she was being followed for a while by her attacker, or maybe she saw them in the bushes or something and went to call her house, and then the attacker ambushed her and threw her phone into the bushes, which is how it could have broken, if it was broken. So as all of these searches were going on at the crime scene and her body was being tested for any kind of DNA evidence, police elsewhere were also questioning her family, her friends, people that she knew, just to see what Heather's life was like, if there was anyone that maybe didn't like her, anyone that might want to hurt her. But like I said, Heather was a very positive, very happy, smiley girl. She was very well liked, and her family and friends couldn't think of anyone that might want to do this to her at all. She didn't have any revengeful exes, she didn't have anyone that she'd really fallen out with, so this seemed like it was more than likely a crime of opportunity. It seems as though Heather had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and someone was there looking to hurt another human being, and Heather just happened to be the first one that they saw. As the news of Heather's murder began circulating around Tamworth, the streets pretty much deserted. And this was a place where a lot of teenagers used to hang about on the streets. Kids would just go to the park alone and meet up with their friends, and all of that stopped. Everyone was too scared to go outside. Of course, there's an opportunistic murderer on the loose, and the possibility of them striking again is very high. So all of a sudden, everyone started locking their doors while they were still inside. They started traveling in groups. They wouldn't let their children walk to and from school anymore. So pretty early on in the case, police theorized that the killer could have been local to the park, or more than likely was local to the park because this was a very secluded area, somewhere that you would probably only know exists if you lived in that town. It's not like it's a known park in Staffordshire. It's like if you live in Tamworth, you know of it. It seemed as though this killer knew exactly where they could kill and hide a body without being seen or heard. So police were now looking at this case and wondering how they were going to go about it. How do you go about finding a murderer when you have absolutely no leads? There was no one that they could look at, no one suspicious, and they had a body that probably didn't have any evidence on it. They did appeal to the news and in newspapers and things like that, but in the meantime, while you're waiting for calls to come in, what else is there to do? So they began looking at past similar crimes from that area. So sexual crimes within the last kind of year in Tamworth. Because the likelihood is that if someone can kill another human being in a sexually motivated way, then they're probably capable of doing other things. And they probably have done other things. It's normally an escalation with crimes like these. It's never normally someone's first crime. Murder. So police looked through a lot of reports of indecent exposure, recent reports of indecent exposure, which is like getting naked in public, like revealing your body in public. And there were a lot of reports to go through from Tamworth. There were about 150 indecent exposure cases within the last year. Interestingly enough, the autopsy of Heather Tell's body revealed that she hadn't actually been raped or sexually assaulted from what they could tell from her body. Even though the crime scene of this murder pointed towards this being a sex crime, with Heather being found naked, it didn't seem to be one. But that doesn't mean it wasn't sexually motivated. Maybe the killer was planning on sexually assaulting or raping Heather, and maybe they killed her by accident first and then freaked out and ran away. Maybe they sexually assaulted her in ways that wouldn't show up on the body, if you know what I mean. Penetration isn't the only way that someone can be sexually assaulted. Or maybe this was a sexually motivated crime, but they never intended on sexually assaulting them. So they could have got some level of sexual gratification from this without actually doing anything to Heather. Although she was found naked, like I said, her underwear was found near her body. So despite the rain and everything, crime scene investigators were really hoping that maybe some DNA had got caught or lodged in her underwear, and then maybe that could be one of the things that leads to a killer being charged. Through the inspection of the crime scene, it was discovered that the murder weapon used to strangle Heather Tell had actually been her own shoelace. And it seemed as though the killer had taken their time with this. So like I said, tests were being done on her body and on the clothing found near her body to see if any DNA could be identified. But while that was going on, other police officers continued investigating other avenues of this case. They set about creating a suspect profile, which is a set of characteristics that police believe that the murderer might have based on how they carried out the crime. I hope that made sense. So things like they believe this was a sexually motivated crime, and because it was against a teenage girl, that makes police believe that this was an older man that carried out the crime. They also believe that the murderer probably has a criminal history, particularly in sex crimes, because, like I said, it's very unusual for murder to be someone's first crime. They normally kind of work their way up. So they're looking for people that have indecent exposure charges, maybe sexual assault charges, possibly even rape charges. And again, like I said closer to the beginning of the video, they believe that the murderer probably lives within about 5 miles of the park for them to know that that would be kind of like a good place to commit a crime like this. So now that they had this suspect profile, they were using that in the appeals on like news channels and in newspapers. They were saying that they believed the murderer had these characteristics, and if anyone had a feeling that they knew who had done this, then they need to get in contact with police. So by now, this case was national news. It was being shown on news channels up and down the country. It was on every single newspaper. And I think just a lot of the country really empathised with Heather and her family. She was a very normal teenage girl, a child, going about her normal life when she was viciously attacked and her life was savagely taken away from her. And this really showed when it came to Heather's funeral, which actually had a turnout of over 2,000 people. 2,000 people. People were pouring out of the church, people were queuing down the pavements along the road, watching the cars go up to the church. It was very clear that this murder had touched a lot of people, and a lot of people were in support of Heather and her family to get her justice. It could have been anyone. It could have been anyone's daughter, anyone's sister, anyone's friend. It really hit the community hard, and police kind of played on that relatability in their public appeals. I actually have a quote from one of the newspaper appeals here that says, "There must be someone out there who, for reasons of misguided loyalty, is shielding someone that they have suspicions about. I would hate to think that anyone could look at a photograph of this gentle, kind-hearted teenager and knowingly harbour her killer." And as these appeals started airing in the newspapers and things, people started coming forward. People were calling, giving potential leads that they thought they had. One of the first leads that police received was from a young man who was riding his bike in that same park that Heather was murdered in on the night that she was murdered. And he said that on this bike ride, he'd seen the same man multiple times, this suspicious looking man who seemed to be in his 30s or 40s, which, bear in mind, is the kind of age bracket that the suspect profile was putting the killer at, or estimating the killer to be at. This cyclist's name was Johannes Prins, and he'd been cycling to a friend's house that night when he rode past a middle-aged man hiding in a bush in that park, which of course sounds weird right from the off, but there are potential explanations for that. You know, maybe he'd lost something in the bush, maybe he was looking for something, I don't know. As Prince got closer on his bike, this man in the bush spotted him cycling by, and this man lifts his hands and covers his face until Prince has cycled past. So he could have easily made it look less suspicious that he was hiding in this bush, but no, he covered his face and fully made it look like he was hiding. But you know, Prince didn't think anything of it. He didn't know that anyone had been murdered or attacked in that area, so you know, you just think it's someone being weird in a bush. However, he went to this friend's house, he was there for about an hour, and then he began cycling back home. He was cycling just along by Belgrave Dance Studio, which was where Heather was supposed to be meeting her friend that night, when he cycled into that same man again. This man got right in his path and forced Prince to, halt his bike. And because he stopped when this man was right in front of him, this meant that Prince got a really good look at this man's face, a really good look at his features, and he was able to describe this man in a lot of detail to police, even down to, the shape of the belt buckle he was wearing. Apparently he was wearing, all royal blue, and the timing of this encounter lines up perfectly with just after Heather's murder. So police believe that Heather was murdered any time between 8 and 8:30, and Prince ran into this guy just after 8:30. So it could well be Heather's murderer. Another tip that police received from the public actually included a name. So this was their first proper lead, their first proper person of interest. And this lead came from a group of co-workers at a stationery store in Tamworth. A young 19-year-old girl that worked at this stationery store had confided in her co-workers that she had a bad feeling about her father in relation to this case. Of course, this girl is hesitant to come forward about her own father. I think anyone would be, but she knew that she kind of had to because this was very serious. But she was just very scared to, so her first step was confiding in her work friends. She told her co-workers that her father had a history of sex crimes. When she was very young, he spent 2 years in prison for an attempted rape, and on the night of Heather Tell's murder, he didn't come home. And when he finally came home the next morning, he was soaking wet, he was very dishevelled, very messy, very seemingly exhausted, he was tired. And he didn't have an excuse as to where he'd been last night or where he'd been all morning. And so she was very suspicious. And after confiding in her co-workers that she believed her father might be responsible, they knew that they had to go to the police. They couldn't keep this information and just wait for their friend to kind of do it on her own. This was a very serious matter, and this was a very dangerous man on the loose. And so they went to the police themselves. This young girl was 19-year-old Lindsay Chidgey, accusing her 45-year-old father, Michael Chidgey, a coach driver from Tamworth. And so police began looking into their first suspect, Michael Chidgey. And when they looked at his past criminal history, they realised that he'd done way more than just that one attempted rape that his daughter knew of. He had a long history of sex crimes. Mainly when he was younger, he actually hadn't done anything criminal for around 17 years. His first charge was when he was just 16 years old, and that was for indecent exposure. And there are 9 other indecent exposure charges on his record, one of which actually took place at the same park where Heather Tell was murdered. But of course, the main charge on his record that was causing the most concern was that attempted rape from 17 years prior. This particular incident happened one day when he was driving in his car and he noticed that a woman on that same road had broken down. So he pulled over and walked over and offered his help. And this woman, in her very vulnerable state, she was rather desperate for help, she let him help. And he took advantage of that, and when the coast was clear, he attacked her and tried to rape her. Luckily, she managed to fight him off before he could do any major harm to her, and he ran back to his car and drove away, but not before she managed to jot down his license plate so she could report him to the police. Like I said, he served 2 years in prison for that attempted rape, and then once he left prison, there was nothing else on his record. So whether he had tried to commit a crime and it just wasn't reported, I don't know. But it seems from that point on that the prison time had deterred him from committing similar crimes. So Michael Chidgey was brought into the police station for questioning, and he denied all involvement in Heather Tell's murder. And nothing really came of this questioning, and because they had no evidence against him, they had to let him go. Police thought that their best bet in this case would be DNA evidence, but of course, due to the rain on the morning that Heather Tell's body was found, it was going to be hard to find any DNA of a perpetrator on her body. They had to use a relatively new technique called DNA profiling. Now, I don't fully understand this, but I'll try and explain it to the best of my ability. Basically, a DNA profile isn't quite as specific as a DNA sample. So each human in the world has a specific, unique DNA sample, but multiple people will have similar DNA profiles. So a DNA sample has more information in it. A DNA profile is a more kind of watered down version of your DNA sample, which takes out a lot of the specifics, which means that it would then fit a lot of people. Does that make sense? Basically, it's hard to come across someone with your same DNA profile or a similar DNA profile. It can happen, but it's unlikely. And that's what they're looking for here, a DNA profile, because this was in the year 2000, technology wasn't amazing, that was the best they could do, really. So basically, if the DNA profile was a match to Michael Chidgey, it wasn't exact evidence that it was his DNA, but it was pretty likely that it was his DNA, because there's a 1 in 70 million chance that someone else has the same DNA profile. So, you know, it pretty much is. So, Michael's DNA was taken with a little swab on his cheek, and it was sent off to the lab to test against anything that they could find on Heather Tell, on her underwear, on anything. And it was very unlikely that they were going to find something large enough to test against Michael's DNA because of the rain. But they did find something, a small sample on her underwear, and it was tested against Michael Chidgey's DNA, and it was a match. And this DNA match was enough evidence for police to arrest Michael, but maybe not enough for them to convict him, because, like I say, it was a profile, not an exact sample match. But they were going to worry about that later. Right now, they just needed to focus on arresting Michael Chidgey. If he had committed this murder, he was a danger. He was dangerous to have out on the streets. So police immediately went and arrested him and took him to the police station. Chidgey was questioned once again now that they had this new evidence, and he was asked, "How is your DNA on Heather Tell's underwear?" And he explained how his DNA was on her underwear by saying that he liked to go into women's underwear shops and fondle the underwear when it was still on the coat hanger, still on the rack. Touch these women's underwear before they'd even been bought, and he just kind of liked that. He got off on the fact that he'd touched these women's underwear and then they were going to be bought and worn by women one day. That was like his thing. And so he tried to tell police that maybe he'd been into an underwear store, touched this bra, and then Heather had been in maybe that same day or the next day and bought one of the bras that he fondled in the store. And that is how his DNA got on Heather's bra. It sounds ridiculous. It really does. But at the same time, police have to look into it. They can't not. And so they got in contact with this specific underwear company. It was quite a big brand. I don't know what brand. They got in touch with that company and they got a representative round to come and look at the bra. Basically, if this professional from the brand said that this bra looked in relatively new condition, then Michael's story could be true. But if this representative from the brand said, no, this bra looks worn, it looks like it's been washed a few times, like it's deteriorating a bit, then it's obvious that Heather's had this bra for a while, it's been in the wash a few times, there's no possible way that he could have touched it in the store and that DNA has still been on it on the day of her murder. So he must have touched it around the day of her murder. And what do you know? This representative comes, they look at the bra and they say, no, this has definitely been washed a lot of times. The stitching was kind of coming away. This was a relatively old bra of Heather's. And that shows that Michael Chidgey must have touched the bra around the time of Heather's murder. At this point, they had a pretty solid case against Michael Chidgey being the killer. However, the police just wanted as much evidence as they possibly could just to make sure that they could get this man behind bars. And so police decided to call back in Prince, that cyclist that had seen the suspicious looking man twice on the night of Heather's murder, who actually saw this man close up and knew what he looked like. They put Chidgey and a bunch of other kind of similar looking men in a police lineup, an identity parade, and they brought Prince in and they said, right, okay, are any of these men the one that you saw on that night? And he picked out Chidgey. He actually said that it was Chidgey without a doubt. So he was pretty confident about that. So that was it for police. That was enough evidence for them to charge Michael Chidgey with the murder of Heather Tell and for this whole thing to go to trial. So the trial began in December of 2001, a year and a half after the murder took place, and they had all kinds of witnesses. They had Prince, the cyclist, they had Michael Chidgey's own wife or his daughter. I don't know which one, could have been both. Of course, because he hadn't come home that night, and when he came home the next morning, he was soaking wet and dirty, so they needed to testify that. They had the representative from the underwear company, as well as the physical evidence of the DNA profile match, because even though it wasn't a specific sample match, there was still a 1 in 70 million chance that this was not Michael Chidgey's DNA, which is, big enough for them to use it as evidence. So the jury went to deliberate and they came back with a majority verdict, 11-1, that Michael Chidgey was guilty of the murder of Heather Tell. He was sentenced to life in prison as the judge deemed him a danger to women that must never be free again. But yeah, that's it for this case. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks again to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. If you want to get 70% off of your subscription, making it just $3.49 a month, plus an extra month free, then make sure you're going through my link, nordvpn.com/Eleanor, and using code Eleanor at checkout. And back to this. Look at that. Zoom in. It says my name. I have merch, finally. Only 1 million subscribers and I've got merch. By the way, thank you so much for 1 million subscribers. This is my first video since I hit that milestone, which is freaking crazy. But yeah, I finally have merch. I'll put a little thing on the screen of all of my merch. I've got hoodies, I've got long sleeves in black and white, I've got mugs in black and white, I've got phone cases. The only official retailer of my merch is eleanorneale.shop. Link is on the screen right now. Link is in the description. Everywhere else is not official. Don't go there. Thank you to everyone that has purchased a piece of the merch so far. It's been making me really happy seeing everyone in them on social media. So if you do want to get one, link is down below. Thank you so much to all of my channel members for their continued support with the channel, especially to tier 2 that helped me choose the cases that I cover. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, make sure you leave a thumbs up on the video. If you want to subscribe to my channel, you can click this circle right here. If you want to subscribe to my second channel, you can click this circle here. And if you want to watch another video from me, there's a playlist on screen right now. Okay, thank you, bye.